first of all, Paul, I suppose, just a brief word on the Taoiseach deciding to come out and say what he said, where he was, I suppose, in Washington.
I think about 45 minutes before it was due to be announced, word filtered out that there was an announcement coming. I think we all knew at that stage it was going to be substantial, that we were talking about restrictions and how we live our lives, and that was on the basis of this coronavirus taking a particular path. The Taoiseach had been travelling to the United States. We knew that he was going to do that. And obviously the Irish-American link is so key. It is important that we retain that link. But what do you know, we had to make the announcement from there. And then very quickly it got into the detail of it. And then you had parties rowing in afterwards. So I think it was, at a personal sense, it was unfortunate that he happened to be in Washington, but it didn't stop, the message getting out.
And it was a very short statement. It was concise. It was to the point. He didn't take any questions. The questions then came afterwards, Sandra, where there was a press conference over in government buildings. You were across that. Remind us who was there. And I suppose it was really about getting that detail out, wasn't it?
Yeah, and quite a solemn occasion, obviously. 5 cabinet ministers and the Chief Medical Officer, Tony Holohan, together. And the key message, I suppose, from government, as it has been the whole way through all of this, is that they are following the public health advice and they're not making decisions on their own. This isn't political, that they are following the lead of the health authorities, and that was underlined this morning. And the key message that they delivered, I suppose, at that press conference is why they've taken this move. We sort of expected it might have been coming. The government had been stressing the whole time that it was about doing it at the right stage, not going too early and not leaving it too late. And what we heard was that 2 things changed last night. So the European Centre for Disease Control changed their guidelines, and the Irish government and the health authorities are cognizant of that. But also Tony Holohan said they got information that there had been a significant increase in confirmed cases of coronavirus. Also, there had been a rise in community transmissions. There had been clusters, including in 2 healthcare facilities. So the key medical advice, the health advice, is that they had to act now, that now was the stage where they could act to prevent the spread, which is why they made all these announcements.
And the language, I think, was very, there were very serious words being used. But also, I think Simon Coveney a few times saying, that, look, acknowledging that the government asking an awful lot of people, asking a lot of the country. It is unprecedented. We're in new territory here, really.
Yeah, completely. I mean, they're making announcements and announcing restrictions, as you said, in relation to schools and facilities and where people work that are going to have a really immediate effect in nearly every area of people's lives and in their family lives and how we work and how we interact and all that kind of thing. And I suppose what's a little unclear is that while these restrictions they've announced today, they're in place until March 29th, that's just over 2 weeks away. They could be lifted at some stage if things get better, but they could be extended. And they were warning of that also. I mean, it all depends on how the coronavirus spreads as they track these figures every day. But certainly the key message is that it has got to the stage where there are increased community transmissions now. That's what they were always afraid of. And that's the sort of the key criteria that they've used to introduce these more stringent measures.
It's, I suppose, in a way, for members of the public, and obviously we've all seen on social media that, people are very concerned and people are stressed out and anxious and all the rest of it. But I suppose it's good in a way, is it, to see government ministers like this come together along with public health officials, along with, people who really know what they're talking about. Is it, David? Is it very important, for example, for Tony Holohan to be there today with all those government ministers in front of the press?
I think it is, and it's something that we've seen actually in other times of emergency, for instance, with significant floods, snow, when we've had very, very severe storms, that the message that comes from the officials, the people who know what they're talking about, has that little bit of extra gravitas. These are people who are experts in their field. And it's interesting the government is making good use of Dr. Tony Holohan. And I think he has been quite solid, calm. He's been trying to manage expectations, but at the same time give a clear idea of where we're going. I don't think there's major surprise about most of the announcement today. I think, however, the things perhaps which people weren't expecting so much was the level of detail in terms of mass gatherings. People perhaps might have thought mass gatherings like big things like Leopardstown, concerts, but actually no, mass gatherings, the new definition as outlined by the government, actually isn't that big.
It's 100 people
100
indoors,
people indoor,
500 people outdoors. Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, there's a raft of social engagements, confirmations, weddings, the usual things that would be going on right around the country being affected by this, and it's really drilling down into ordinary people's lives.
It's incredible in a way, isn't it? I suppose how politics works, Paul, because I suppose the job of politicians really not only is it to run the country, but it's also to advise. And very often, and especially as we've just come out of a general election, we can see that people sometimes don't respond very well to politicians, or there's criticism. There's a lot of criticism, but actually, when we are under this sort of, again, I'll say the word unprecedented, new territory, politicians are the people that we look to and the public look to, I suppose, don't they?
Well,
as well
looking
as
to them
the
in
officials.
particular for the reasons just outlined by Sandra, is that these are the individuals who are curtailing people's lives, and something as intimate as a wedding or a funeral. I mean, this really goes to the core of things. Well, I think the politicians themselves are very mindful that they are projecting out to the general population, and that's one of the reasons you see such consensus around this approach. Even if the politicians have got differing ideas, or maybe the timing of when a measure should be taken or the extent of a measure, they're keeping it close. So, for example, there was a broad support of the government's announcement from opposition parties today. The party leaders, Micheál Martin, Mary Lou McDonald, were going to attend a meeting with the ministers, which is actually taking place now, but they were saying that they were going to bring suggestions and recommendations to that meeting. So they weren't berating the government. What they were saying is they're going to take their ideas, take it into that room, hammer it out and try and get an agreed position. And I think that is very, very important, because we have already seen some signs of panic where people are going into Tesco and buying, according to Fran McNulty, our Consumer Affairs correspondent, 60 tins of creamed rice for reasons known only to the individual themselves.
Wouldn't be my choice. Wouldn't be my choice.
You need to have that unified message. And I think, from the CMO, it has been clear, it has been concise, and it has been calm. And that's the way it needs to continue.
And Heather Humphreys, Sandra, was at that press conference, Minister for Business and Enterprise. And yesterday, actually, I was at a press conference. She was at that as well. And again, she was reiterating today, do not panic buy. And yet we're seeing now across social media this afternoon, it seems like triggered by Leo Varadkar's announcement at 11:30 this morning, people are really emptying the shelves, or trying to.
And the message from Heather Humphreys, and she said this several times this morning, was that she's been talking to the supermarkets. There's no shortage of anything. There's no worry that we're going to run out of things. But yet, as you say, we are seeing, photos of people, trolleys, the whole length of a supermarket with people stocking up on items. And I suppose a concern would be that by doing so, they are going to reduce supplies. But supermarkets certainly tell us that they have plenty coming, and there's no reason that supply chains will be disrupted in any way. In fact, that was underlined today. There's a continuous, commerce and business is going on in that way. It's not interrupted by this, and the shelves will be restocked all the time. So, but it's unfortunate that despite all that messaging, people are going out and they are buying stuff.
I think the one item that there was a problem with, and that was the alcohol-based hand gel. I mean, that one is short.
Yeah. So, David, obviously, people are very concerned. I suppose it depends on what you've got going on in your family and your immediate life, whether it's concern about loved ones and their health, or implications to your day-to-day. How do you get somebody to mind the kids now? How are you going to manage work, etc., like that? But, I mean, business is continuing, as Sandra just said. There's no problems with the supply chain. But we are hearing things like 80% of restaurant bookings down, tourism industry, very concerned, obviously, now about tourists not coming to Ireland. The knock-on effect to the economy of something like this. Now, we're talking at the moment about just over 2 weeks of a shutdown. We do not want to really talk about that R word, but we will have to mention a recession. Is it possible we're looking at a recession?
It's quite possible. So technically what it means is 2 quarters of a contraction within the economy. And it's worth bearing in mind where we're coming from. And we're coming from very strong growth. Growth last year was projected to be around 8%, projected to be about 5% this year. So we'll have to see what's going to happen with that. But for the Irish economy, there's 2 things. There's the economic effect of businesses having a lot less custom. And then there's a second effect on the public finances, because the state will collect a lot less tax revenue. So we'll have to see how that's going to play out. The state was going to run a surplus this year. But the government came out earlier this week and they announced a €3 billion package to help with the effect on the economy of the coronavirus. That basically wipes out the surplus. It's probably the right thing to do. And today there's been an awful lot of activity. We've seen the head of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, someone who's well known here from her involvement with various European institutions and with the IMF. She came out and she said, well, look, we want to see governments across the developed world where the crisis is where the coronavirus is now spreading, taking action. And what she means by taking action is hitting the accelerator, pushing money into the economy. And that's exactly what Ireland has done. So I think probably the government here deserves some credit for that. We'll have yet to see how it's going to play out. Second thing that happened was the European Central Bank was expected to cut interest rates. Those interest rates are already in negative territory. It didn't do that. It left the interest rates unchanged. So the markets didn't particularly like that. But what this European Central Bank did do is it's trying to flush a little bit more money into the system. That's going to help the banking system. Sandra was talking earlier about the press conference with Heather Humphreys. Heather Humphreys has been in touch with the banks to make sure that they've adequate liquidity. And what that is about is ensuring that when businesses get onto her and get onto the banks and are looking for financial backup, that financial backup is there. I think the other thing that's worth bearing in mind is we've seen another big fall in the stock markets today. And obviously that is really a forward-looking thing in the sense that they're looking at what is going to happen to individual companies. Are they going to be incurring losses? If they think they're going to be incurring losses, they tend to sell the stock. So it gives you a good idea of what is coming down the track. And then I think the big bogeyman is the bond market. Now, the bond market is exactly like the plumbing in your house. When it's working perfectly, that's absolutely fine. You don't even know it's there. But when it backs up, you know all about it. And I think that people will look at the Italian bond market and they've already seen the cost of borrowing is going up for Italy. It's got an awful lot of borrowing and we can see the scale of the crisis is far more severe there. And I think that the knock-on consequences from the Italian economy onto the Eurozone economy will filter towards Ireland. I think that would be a concern. But in all of this, this is about money, this is about incomes, but in all of this, lives come first.
Yeah, of course. I was with you there. You didn't lose me. You explained it all very well, David. Thank you very much. But it is a worry, obviously. And it's a worry, I suppose, looking ahead to the next few weeks and months and how this all pans out. And Pascal Donoghue was at the briefing yesterday with Heather Humphreys, obviously, putting that money in. It must be a very strange situation, Paul, for the likes of these individuals, Leo Varadkar, Pascal Donoghue, Heather Humphreys, Simon Coveney, Simon Harris.
Do you know what I think they're probably?
Fine Gael.
I think that they're
ministers,
thinking.
yeah.
I think they're thinking more than they ever have done.
Yeah.
I think they're having to think ahead. Like it was interesting to hear Micheál Martin say today that in a meeting the leaders had with some of the officials on Monday, they were discussing schools and they were going through that issue of whether it was now the right time or not, or what would the right time be. Sandra outlined those issues of clusters and numbers, but they were going through all that. Then they had to leave that meeting, walk out and conduct interviews, be interviewed by people like you, and in the back of their mind knowing far more than they were able to say. So I think they're having to be thinking about that all of the time, thinking about how they conduct themselves, thinking about their interaction with the parties, thinking about their reactions with leaders. I'd say they've got a headache from around lunchtime from the amount of thought that's having to go into it because they know so much is hanging in the balance. I mean, obviously what we hope is that this is, the peak is reached very quickly, it begins to go down and we are able to learn far more about this virus to be able to protect ourselves, later on in the year or in the coming years. But just at this moment, we're in the stage of not knowing exactly what's happening. It's very, very difficult.
An incredible situation for them to be in. And then, of course, Simon Coveney was asked at the press conference about the talks between members of his party and members of Fianna Fáil, which were supposed to be happening today, informal talks ahead of any sort of government formation talks. So they're postponed for today?
They're postponed, and that would be expected. But it was going to be a big day. I mean, this was two big negotiating teams from two parties traditionally been taking lumps out of each other, and what they were talking about was forming a programme for government. Micheál Martin was asked on the RTÉ News at 1, did he believe that there could be a agreement reached within the next 2 weeks. He said he didn't think that was the case, but that it was clear the parties had to work their way towards that. So while you do have this coronavirus, you are still also going to have parties trying to form a government because they believe that's the way. If you've got a majority government, it means you can prioritise legislation, you can be decisive, you can enact it, and you can ensure it's delivered on. And so that is a political imperative.
Let's just talk about the legislation that they're going to be putting through, because they're meeting, Sandra, next Thursday again. The Dáil is supposed to convene again on Thursday, the 19th. The seats are all very close together. Are they going to be able to kind of, have a socially isolating kind of distance between themselves, I wonder, in the Dáil when the TDs come back here?
Yeah, certainly when you see the Dáil chamber in particular, it's an old chamber, the seats are very close together, but we've been told that they have a system. They're going to be able to control the flow of people in and out so that, and ensure the representation of each of the parties so that they can pass the legislation. And as we know, they've got this emergency legislation on the sick pay proposals that were signed off on Monday. So the Dáil is coming back next Thursday, and the Seanad as well. So, and that's interesting as well, because you've got the outgoing Seanad. They haven't been newly elected. That sort of, the voting on that is going on at the moment, but the sort of outgoing senators are going to sit as well to pass that legislation. So yes, we're told that they have got sort of proposals in place to deal with the fact that they can't sit so close together.
Fascinating times, and that's it for now, I suppose. But obviously lots more to discuss, and we'll be back with you again. If you enjoyed the podcast, you can subscribe, leave a review. From me, Maggie Doyle, David Murphy, Paul Cunningham and Sandra Hurley, thank you very much for listening. Look after each other, won't you? Keep on washing the hands. But we will be back with another podcast very soon.